it is.
That's me.
So I wonder if I can do a local recording too, Chris, or whether since you've hit record, that's doing it for both of us.
No, you have to do a local record on your end as well.
Okay. So I'll hit that now just to be safe. Yeah, it says it's already recording to the cloud, so maybe because you're a co-host, it's going to record to our cloud.
Okay.
Okay, here's Doug.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
So I'm on my phone, but it won't
That's
let
strange.
me log through my computer.
Okay, so can you see us, Doug?
I can see you. I can't see anybody else.
Okay. So if I share your slides, then you should be able to see them.
Yeah, you have my slides, right?
Yeah. Then Kelly, I'm going to make you a co-host so then you can share your slides.
Perfect, because I've added a couple since I sent them to you yesterday.
Really strange. Let's try this one.
So Doug, I'm just going to do a test on your slides and then you can tell me if you see them.
Okay.
Can you see that now?
Yep.
Okay. So you can just tell me when to change.
Okay.
Scott, you know what? I'm gonna email you a copy of my latest slides just in case.
Okay.
So you have them,
Yeah, okay.
because I have technical difficulties all the time. So,
Yeah, okay. Well, and you're trusting me. Okay, I'll wait another minute and then I'll start letting people in. We've got 24 in the wait room.
It's really, really strange. I was sitting there, I was logged in, and then all of a sudden it just said the host booted me out. And it was like, oh. And then every time I've tried to log back in, it just keeps saying the same thing. So
Hmm.
I was like, oh, are they trying to tell me something? They've got my slides. I guess they want to do the presentation. Okay.
I was trying to make some kind of a health and safety joke, but I got nothing. Like, I'm going to let people in.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. Zoom is still admitting people from the wait room, so we'll wait until everybody's in and then we'll get started. Okay, I think we have most everyone in now from the wait room, and the others can join us in progress. Thanks everyone for joining us today for this webinar on a very important topic. For those that I haven't met, I'm Scott McCammon, President and CEO of the Milton Chamber of Commerce. And as you probably see, I'm surrounded by a box of by a wall of rapid test kits and KN95 masks, and then later today, I'll be surrounded by Lysol wipes because the manufacturers of Lysol have been kind enough to donate a transport truck full of Lysol wipes that we're giving out free to local businesses. So stay tuned for information on that. We'll have that in the chamber newsletter. In the meantime, let's get started with today's webinar. We have two amazing speakers joining us today, and so I'm going to do a brief introduction on both of them, and then after that, Doug will start, and then Kelly, and then we'll get into a Q&A. And if you want, you can put your chat. But we're also going to do live questions. So if you raise that Zoom hand, then in theory you'll go to the top of the screen, and I'll see that you have a question. I'll ask you to then unmute and ask your question live. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Kelly Gray. Kelly's a member of the Labor Employment Civil Litigation Practice Group at O'Connor McLeod Hanna in Oakville. Kelly Oakville has her Bachelor of Arts from McMaster and attended law school at Queen's University. Kelly helps clients navigate through issues such as wrongful and constructive dismissal, human rights complaints, pension disputes, occupational health and safety issues, breach of contract, and everything to do with COVID legalities. So it's a pleasure to have Kelly Gray with us today. And Doug Suley. Doug has a passion for safety, so it's no surprise that Doug launched Suley Safety Services in March of 2015 to offer health and safety training and consulting services to small and medium-sized businesses. Since he graduated from Brock University in 2007, Doug has worked in workplace safety capacity in lumber, transportation, construction, warehousing, logistics. He's a member of the Joint Health and Safety Committee and managing health and safety programs in the workplace. So definitely another expert to have with us today. Doug is having computer issues or connectivity issues to Zoom by his computer. So Doug's on his phone. So I'm going to try to share Doug's screen. So with Doug, I'll share your screen and you can start.
Okay, great. Thanks, Scott. So I guess all that education I got and all that experience doesn't help me with technology today. So I do apologize for the little glitch here, but we'll make sure that we go through this as best we can. So as Scott said, my name is Doug Suley. I run a health and safety consulting firm, Suley Safety Services, based in Mississauga. We work with a lot of small to medium-sized businesses to help them navigate the health and safety requirements, and for the last year and a half, navigating the COVID-19 requirements as well. So today we're going to talk about a few different things. I'm going to go through some reminders in regards to what businesses need to have in place, as well as talk about the vaccine passports and give a little bit of information on that. And then I believe we're going to pass it over to Kelly, who will go over the employer-employee side with regards to the vaccines. So we'll start with the regulations and guidelines. So we'll move to the next slide, Scott. So the regulations that are currently in place include Regulation 36420, which is your rules for areas in Stage 3 under the Reopening Ontario Act. This has been updated with the Roadmap to Reopen. That Roadmap to Reopen was paused for a while due to the increasing cases that have arisen here. There's also a new regulation that came into place on September 22nd, which is Regulation 64521. This is rules for areas at step 3 at the roadmap exit step. There's also some guidance that's been provided not only from the Ministry of Labor, who's developed over 200 sector-specific guidelines for businesses to use to help them mitigate COVID-19 in the workplace, but also the recent proof of vaccination guidance has also been released. I have provided the link here in the slides, but I will be happy to send it to all the participants afterwards. So the regulations and guidelines, businesses or organizations must comply with any applicable municipal bylaws, Section 22 orders issued by local medical officers of health under the Health Protection and Promotion Act, and any other applicable instructions, policies, or guidelines issued by the Government of Ontario. All applicable legislative and regulatory requirements related to health and safety, such as those in the Health and Safety Act and regulations, do continue to apply. While the ROA sets out certain specific requirements with respect to worker health and safety, the Health and Safety Act requires employers must take every precaution reasonable in the circumstance to protect the health and safety of workers. This includes protecting workers from hazards posed by infectious diseases, and the employer must meet all requirements under both statutes. So with regards to returning to work, so we'll go down a bit farther, Scott. Thank you. Nowhere is this business as usual. I think, as bad as it sounds, I think what we have now is kind of going to be almost the norm for the next quite a while, actually, I think. The reality is, though, if you don't have any people working for you, you don't have an organization. As employees are returning to the workplace after being laid off or forced to work at home because of COVID restrictions, they are worried about protecting themselves and their families. They could be worried about spreading or catching COVID-19. They could be worried about job security, quality of childcare that's available, and may have significant mental health concerns. As an employer, you do have the responsibility to provide the safest environment that you can, and you must ensure that the managers are focused and intentional about managing their team's psychological health and safety. So with regards to vaccines, vaccines are safe, effective, and the best way to protect you and those around you from serious illnesses like COVID-19. Vaccines work with your immune system, so your body will be ready to fight the virus if you're exposed, reducing the risk of developing COVID-19, and it will make the symptoms milder in most cases if you do in fact get it. As an employer, you do have a critical role in promoting the importance of COVID-19 vaccine, including providing vaccine information from credible sources. We do know that there are many different types of sources out there. What everybody looks at, I do believe ultimately is their choice. However, my only thing to say to that would be just please make sure it's something that is credible. Supporting the vaccine champions to initiate conversations with their peers. There could be people within your workplace who are very big believers on the vaccine. It could be a great way to help spread the message to the rest of your workforce. Providing paid leave to get vaccinated. Reminding workers they are legally entitled to up to 3 paid sick days if they have side effects from the vaccine. Offering incentives to get vaccinated, or hosting an on-site vaccination clinic. These are all different ways an employer can play a critical role. So one of the other important components right now that must be put into place is a COVID-19 safety plan. The Ministry of Labor and the Ontario government have provided a template that can be used. The template is perfectly acceptable, and it actually allows you to develop your safety plan based on each of the different requirements, which we'll go through. Recently, they have released an online version that's almost like one of those wizard tools that you can follow that, and it'll help you develop it as well. Make sure that you have measures for screening. Any screening that you do in the workplace must be based on the Ministry of Health screening measures tool, which was been released about 6 to 8 months ago, and it has been updated recently as well. It needs to be completed by workers, any essential visitors, and even patrons that are entering the workplace. The screening tool can be sent to customers or patrons in advance. It must be less than 24 hours by email, or it must be available at reception. And you need to keep the records for a minimum of 30 days. You also need to develop isolation procedures. So in the event, if there is a case of COVID, or if someone starts to show symptoms, you need to have processes and procedures in place on how to self-isolate. You also need to take into consideration with the vaccines. There are a little bit difference compared to someone who is vaccinated versus unvaccinated when it comes to testing requirements, as well as self-isolation requirements. Self-isolation, if someone is vaccinated and does not show symptoms, and someone in their household has shown symptoms, the person that's vaccinated does not have to self-isolate unless they are showing symptoms. Cleaning and sanitizing is important too, including high use areas, high touch areas. And one of the most important things you can do is make sure that you document everything that you do. Your documentation is going to be one of the only things that you have that's going to protect you in any case of liability or any sort of issue that may arise. If you don't have a document, your spoken word, unfortunately, it's not good enough. Masks and face coverings are still mandatory. It could be a non-surgical mask or non-medical mask, such as a cloth mask, and it must be worn in all indoor workplaces and when physical distancing is a challenge. Face shields are also an important tool that can be used. This can be used when physical distancing is not possible, but one of the specific instances where a face shield must be considered is for your screening staff or the staff that are performing your screening activities. Physical distancing is one of the best ways to prevent the spread of COVID-19. You need to maintain 6 feet of distance in the workplace. You still need to have the measures that needed to be put into place, such as distancing, setting up separate workstations, reducing your staff whenever possible. You need to develop measures that are going to protect your workers and customers. But however, we all know that sometimes this just is not possible, and you need to make sure that you have measures to protect workers when physical distancing isn't possible. This can be through the use of PPE. This can be through changing the workflow if possible to reduce the amount of time someone is exposed or within 6 feet. And finally, one of the more common things is your workplace signage. So making sure you have signs on your front door for screening, reporting symptoms, the requirements to use masks, and make sure you have signage for physical distancing and hand washing throughout your facility, specifically hand washing and sanitizing in washrooms and any work areas such as lunch rooms or break rooms. So recently on September 22nd, it became required that all workplaces such as restaurants, meeting events, conference centers, all are required to screen their patrons and customers prior to entering the facility. So the Ontario government mandated certain businesses to require customers and patrons to be fully vaccinated and to provide proof of ID and proof of vaccination status to enter the premises. There will be an enhanced vaccine certificate that's set to be released on October 22nd. This is through the QR apps and codes. Guidelines are now available and have been released for businesses to be able to implement this. Just a reminder, an individual is fully vaccinated if they have received the full series of COVID-19 vaccines that are authorized by Health Canada or any combination of those vaccines. One or 2 doses of a COVID-19 vaccine not authorized by Health Canada, followed by 1 dose of a COVID-19 mRNA vaccine that is authorized by Health Canada. 3 doses of a COVID-19 vaccine that's not authorized by Health Canada, and they must have received their final dose of the COVID-19 vaccine at least 14 days before providing the proof of being fully vaccinated. So you do need to have 2 shots as a minimum, specifically if you have the Health Canada ones. However, we do know there's situations where people are coming in from out of town or out of the country that may not have access to the same vaccines. 3 doses under those ones, or 2 of them plus a mRNA that's authorized by Health Canada will be sufficient in regards to that. So the businesses that are required to implement the proof of vaccination include indoor areas of meeting and event spaces, including banquet halls, conference and convention centers, indoor and outdoor areas of food or drink establishments with dance facilities, including nightclubs and resto clubs, but it excludes delivery and takeout. Indoor areas of restaurants, bars, and other food and drink establishments without dance facilities, but excludes the outdoor areas such as patios, delivery, and takeout. Indoor areas of facilities used for sports and recreational fitness activities, including water parks and personal fitness training. This includes gyms, fitness, sporting, and recreational facilities, pools, league sporting events, water parks, and indoor areas of facilities where spectators watch events, but there are some limited exceptions that do apply. Also required in indoor areas of casinos, bingo halls, and other gaming establishments, indoor areas of concert venues, theaters, and cinemas, indoor areas of bathhouse, sex clubs, and strip clubs, indoor areas of horse racing tracks, car racing tracks, and other similar venues, but it includes the indoor only for horse racing and car racing and other similar venues. And finally, indoor areas where film and TV productions take place with studio audiences, but it does not include the cast and crew members. So in order to enter the business and organization, the patron must be able to provide a required proof of identification and proof of being fully vaccinated, and the business and organization must review and confirm this proof. Should an individual choose not to share the required information, then unless the ROA otherwise exempts them from this requirement, they will not be permitted to enter those businesses or organizations that require proof. The customer or patron must ensure their information is complete and accurate as it's provided to businesses and organizations. A business or an organization shall not retain any information provided, and all other public health and workplace safety measures will remain in effect. So just remember, you are required to review the vaccine certificate as well as a piece of ID, but you're not permitted to record any of that information. There are some exceptions, including workers, contractors, repair workers, delivery workers, students, volunteers, inspectors, and others entering the business or organization for work purposes. This doesn't apply where a patron is entering an indoor area solely to use a washroom, to access an outdoor area that can only be accessed through an indoor route, to make a retail purchase, while placing or picking up an order, including placing a bet or picking up winnings in the case of a horse racing track, while paying for an order to purchase admission, or as may be necessary for the purposes of health and safety. This does not apply to businesses or organizations, including those that provide access to necessary medical care, groceries, and basic medical supplies. A business or an organization is exempt from the requirement for patrons who are under 12 years of age, under 18 years of age who are entering for the indoor premises of a facility used for sports and recreational fitness activities, solely for actively participating in an organized sport, in accordance with the guidance published by the Ministry of Health, who are entering the indoor premise of a meeting or event space, including a conference center or convention center, solely for the purposes of attending a wedding service, rite, or ceremony, or a funeral service, rite, or ceremony, but not an associated social gathering, who are entering the indoor premise of a meeting or event space located in a place of worship or in a funeral establishment, cemetery, crematorium, or similar establishment that provides funeral, cemetery, or cremation services for the purposes of attending a social gathering associated with the funeral service, rite, or ceremony. A business who is entering the indoor premises of a meeting or event space other than a place for the purposes of attending a social gathering associated with the wedding service, rite, ceremony, or a social gathering associated with the funeral service, rite, or ceremony on or after September 22nd, 2001, but before October 13th, 2021, as long as the patron produces the results of an antigen test administered within the previous 48 hours, establishing the person is negative for COVID-19. Patrons who provide a written document completed and supplied by a physician designated as an MD or by a registered nurse in the extended class designated as registered nurse, RNEC, nurse practitioner, or NP, stating the individual is exempt for a medical reason from being fully vaccinated against COVID-19 and the effective time period for the medical reason. Patrons with a medical exemption are required to present identification and a written document stating that the individual is exempt from a medical reason to the business or organization. To review proof of medical reason for not being vaccinated against COVID-19, the business must ensure the name of the person in the written documentation matches the identification. The physician or registered nurse in the extended classes information is completed by including the name and contact info of the physician, logo or letterhead identifying the physician or registered nurse, statement that there is a medical reason for the individual's exemption from being fully vaccinated, and any effective time period for the medical reason, which includes the date the patron is seeking access to the business or organization. So the simplest way, especially for any Ontario resident, will have received the Ontario Ministry of Health COVID-19 vaccine receipt. They have received this in their emails. They were provided a copy of it when they went to get their vaccine as well. And they can also log in to the Ministry of Health's website to obtain a copy of their second dose receipt. You need to match the name and date of birth listed on the vaccination receipt against the name and date of birth on a piece of ID. You need to verify it's either an Ontario receipt issued at the time of vaccination, a receipt signed by Indigenous health provider, or a receipt from another jurisdiction that shows the holder is fully vaccinated against COVID-19. Make sure that the receipt says that they've received 2 valid doses and the date is more than 14 days. Some of the acceptable identification that can be provided as proof includes birth certificates, citizenship cards, driver's license, government, Ontario, other issued identification cards, including health cards, Indian status cards or Indigenous membership cards, passport, or permanent resident card. For Ontario residents, expired Ontario government issued identification may be provided as proof of identification. Visitors from within Canada may provide an expired passport, but may not provide expired provincial documents as proof of identification. And all patrons that are visiting from abroad may not provide expired documents as proof of ID. An individual may voluntarily offer an Ontario health card for identification purposes. However, a person or entity who is not a health information custodian must not record or copy the health card number. Individuals have a right to refuse to provide their health cards, and it is an offense under the PHIPA to require the production of a health card or health card number in certain circumstances. Any failure to comply with the requirements can result in charges under the Reopening Ontario Act. The set fine amount starts at $750 for individuals and $1,000 for corporations. Maximum penalties based on prosecution under Part 1 or Part 2 may include fines of up to $100,000 and a year in jail for an individual, up to $500,000 and up to a year in jail for an individual who is a director or officer of a corporation, and up to $10 million for a corporation. One of the considerations that does also need to be taken into play here is violence and harassment concerns. You will potentially have customers and patrons who may not agree with the current mandated requirements. You may have some that feel completely belligerent towards them. Unfortunately, I hope that everybody out there does remain kind. However, we know this doesn't always happen. You do need to make sure that you take violence and harassment considerations consider those as you are developing this process. Making sure that your workers understand that if they come across a situation with a potentially violent or harassing person, that there are measures and procedures in place. This does fall under Human Rights Code, but it also falls under the Health and Safety Act to make sure that you have policies and procedures and you've trained your workers on how to assess the risk and implementing control measures. Okay. If there is an issue and you run into that kind of problem, please call the police. Ontario will be developing and implementing enhanced digital vaccine certificates with unique QR codes and accompanied verification applications, allowing users to securely and safely verify their vaccination status when scanned. Smartphone apps providing proof of vaccination will be accessible to people with disabilities and compatible with adaptive technologies. Paper versions will be downloaded or printed from the COVID vaccination portal or obtained by calling the contact center. Enhanced vaccine certificate as well as a verification app will be available beginning October 22nd. Following this date, patrons will be able to provide a paper copy or digital copy of their vaccine certificate with the QR code to provide proof of vaccination, and older versions of the receipt will still be acceptable as proof of vaccination. So with that, I think I'll pass it over to Kelly, and she can go through her presentation and we'll answer any questions afterwards.
Hi, I'm just trying to figure out how to share my screen here. Can you see that?
It says you started sharing, but I don't see anything yet.
Says my, how's that?
Yep.
Okay. So, hi, my name is Kelly Gray. I'm an employment lawyer at O'Connor McLeod Hanna here in Oakville. I just want to say thank you to Scott, Krista, and everybody at the Milton Chamber of Commerce for inviting me to come and speak here today. And I will preface this discussion by saying that from a public health perspective, I encourage everybody to get vaccinated. And if you have any concerns about the safety or the efficacy of a vaccine, I would encourage you to speak to your doctor. I also am going to give my standard legal caveat, which is everything in this presentation is legal information only. It is not legal advice. If you want legal advice about your specific workplace and specific set of circumstances, please don't hesitate to reach out and contact me directly. We can discuss your unique circumstances. So, without further ado, I'm going to talk about the legal implications of reopening the workplace in what is hopefully the tail end of a pandemic, but we don't know. We know that we are still in the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, all public health and safety measures must still be complied with, many of which were covered by Doug before me. But for the sake of time, I'm going to primarily focus on what has been top of mind for many these days, which is vaccination policies. And if time permits, I will touch briefly on recalling reluctant employees, because I know many employers are having a hard time recalling employees who have either been laid off and maybe collecting various government benefits and don't want to come back at the moment, or employees who are enjoying working remotely and don't want to come back to working in the office. So we'll talk about that as well. So, the first question I often get from employers is, are these even legal? Can we even ask for an employee's vaccination status? Can we even have this type of policy in place? And I'm just going to cut to the chase. The Coles Notes version is, in my opinion, yes, they are legal, subject to human rights and privacy laws. So under the human, and this is, by the way, I'm talking about private employers. I'm not talking about whatever public institutions there are. So for private employers, I just first want to clarify something that has come up in various areas. Under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we have various charter rights. Those charter rights do not apply to a private employer. So an employee does not have any charter rights vis-a-vis a private employer. What you do have is your human rights and your privacy rights and occupational health and safety and all that. So when it comes to, and also, sorry, before I get into this, when it comes to these vaccination policies, I think it's important to emphasize nobody's actually forcing anybody to get a vaccine. Nobody's holding somebody down and forcing something into the arm. All it is, like the nature of these policies, are that people who do choose to get the vaccine have various privileges granted to them that for the time being are not available to others. So in general terms, a private employer can introduce whatever policies and procedures they want in their workplace that they deem to be necessary and effective for their business, provided that they comply with the human rights and privacy laws and other like the Employment Standards Act, etc. So under the Human Rights Code, everybody is free from discrimination in employment based off of a number of prohibited grounds. And as it relates to vaccination policies, the two most relevant would be disability and creed. Creed is similar to religion, but it includes more than just organized religion. I just wanted to say, despite what some people have been saying, maybe on the internet, there is no protected ground under the Human Rights Code for vaccination status. So vaccination status is not a protected ground under the Human Rights Code. So policies, any policy, whether it's a vaccination policy or otherwise, must allow for accommodation for all human rights to the point of undue hardship. So undue hardship, there's a number of things you can take into consideration to determine if something amounts to undue hardship, and health and safety is one of them. So depending on the severity of the risk of infection in your particular workplace, that may dictate what undue hardship actually means for your specific workplace. So if you introduce a policy and an employee claims a human rights-based ground for which they need accommodation, an employer is entitled to ask for proof of such entitlement. In the case of a disability, this generally will involve a doctor's note. And so if you get a doctor's note that just says, oh, so-and-so needs accommodation based off disability, or so-and-so is sick or whatever, you are entitled to push back on that doctor's note and ask for more detailed information so you can determine how and if you can accommodate that particular individual. As I understand it, according to the College of Physicians and Surgeons, there's generally only two conditions that would establish a medical inability to get a vaccine, although I am not a doctor, I defer to the medical community. And these are an allergy to one of the substances in a vaccine that's been confirmed by an allergist, and there's no other way to safely get the vaccine, and a condition called myocarditis or pericarditis. So if the employee has one of those conditions, they may be entitled to a disability-based exemption from whatever vaccination requirement you have. and you as the employer are not entitled to know the specific diagnosis. In the case of CREED, which is the other one that potentially, one of the other common ones that would potentially be raised, as I mentioned, this is similar to, this includes organized religion, but also includes non-organized religion. The leaders of many organized religions have come out in favor of the vaccine, so that, you know, certainly factors into the analysis here. The Human Rights Commission has recently released a statement, which is consistent with their jurisprudence, by the way, which very clearly states that a singular belief against vaccines or a disbelief in the science does not in and of itself constitute creed and does not give rise to a right for accommodation. So creed must be bigger than that. Creed must be a sincerely and freely and deeply held belief that is integrally linked to a person's self-definition and fulfillment, and relates to a comprehensive system of belief that addresses ultimate questions of human existence. So this too must be established by evidence, and you can get the employee to give you certain information so that you can assess whether or not they do have a legitimate creed-based right to exemption. But again, the right to accommodation is subject to undue hardship, which includes health and safety considerations, right? So that may play into it. Human rights are quasi-constitutional, so that means they're not the Constitution, but they're pretty they're quasi-constitutional. They supersede any other statute or regulation or direction or mandate or policy or contract. So, you know, they are paramount, and they should be a first consideration for everyone when drafting your policies. The second thing to consider is privacy laws. So forced disclosure of your health information, which includes vaccination status, you know, could potentially engage an employee's privacy rights. So if you are forcing disclosure of vaccination status, you should consider whether, and I should say the privacy commissioners of all the provinces and of the federal government have joined forces and developed a joint statement on vaccine passports and vaccine mandates. And they've said, you know, in broad strokes, number one, you need the authority to collect this information. That authority can come either from government mandate or from consent, employee consent. And, you know, also you should consider whether the disclosure of this information is necessary, effective, and proportional in light of the health and safety risks that you have in your particular workplace. You know, like this is, I'm talking now about managing the COVID vaccines and all that in the workplace, and not from a broader public health perspective, which is sort of two different considerations. And I should add as a caveat to all of this that, you know, this global pandemic and these vaccine mandates are sort of unprecedented. We've never really gone through something like this before. So, you know, it's prudent for an employer to kind of examine all of these risks, because I am never one to say there's no risk in anything. Like there's always some degree of risk. And when considering your policies and how you're going to implement the policies, you should probably take these sort of factors into consideration, especially, you know, if you're considering a policy that's just vaccinate or you're fired, you might want to think about whether or not that's necessary, effective, and proportional, and if some other less invasive option is available to you that would reasonably protect your workplace. When implementing these policies, you should also advise your employees why you're collecting this information so they understand why it's necessary. And you should also ensure that you safeguard the information. So tell them, you know, we're going to keep it for this long. This is how we're going to keep it. This is who has access to it. And this is, you know, if you're going to delete it at some point, this is when we're going to delete it. Okay, so now that we know that, yes, private companies can implement vaccination policies, provided that they comply with, you know, privacy and human rights-based reasons. And sorry, let me just back up again. There's one thing I wanted to say here. This is with forced disclosure. One way around it, in my view, is just not requiring people to disclose. So you could say, if you choose to disclose that you're vaccinated, that's great. If you don't choose to disclose your vaccination status, that's great as well, but we're going to treat you as though you're not vaccinated, right? And then you're not forcing this disclosure. So now that we know it's legal, the next question people ask is, do I really have to do this? You know, I really don't. Some people say, I don't know if I really want to do this. I don't know if I don't know, especially because there's a lot of employers who, let's face it, are facing a labor shortage right now. And there is some concern about the impact that that is going to have on the business from that perspective. And I mean, that is a practical consideration that many employers want to take into account. Another is employee morale and how that's going to affect productivity. So some organizations, such as hospitals and long-term care facilities, have been directed by the government to put together some form of a vaccination policy. In those cases where you have been directed by the government to do that, then yes, absolutely, it's necessary because you have to comply with the law, right? For other organizations, we're going to start with the Reopening Ontario Act, which Doug alluded to before. So in August, this one of the regulations under this act was amended to add this provision in here, which requires the person responsible for operating a business to follow the advice, recommendations, and instructions by the regional officers of health with respect to establishing, implementing, and enforcing a COVID-19 vaccination policy, or setting out whatever precautions and procedures you have to include in such vaccination policy. Okay, so now this is the law. If the medical officer of health, the Halton medical officer of health, has issued some kind of instruction, then you need to comply with it. So what is the deal in Halton? On September 8th, or September 9th, sorry, which became effective September 10th, the Halton Medical Officer of Health issued amended instructions to businesses. In those amended instructions, there was a provision that workplaces with 100 or more workers that are physically present in the workplace, and that would include if their workplace includes being out in the community, those workplaces must establish, implement, and ensure compliance with the COVID-19 vaccination policy. And that policy must be in place by September 22nd. So if you don't have one yet, you're late. And the policy must be in accordance with the medical officer of health's recommendations for establishing a vaccination policy. So this means these businesses with 100 or more workers have a legal obligation to put a vaccination policy in place. So what is the medical officer's recommendations for establishing a vaccination policy? What they say is, first of all, you need to assess the risk of COVID transmission in your unique workplace, because as I will say later on in this presentation, and this should be the general theme, there's no one size fits all approach here. In my view, I think it depends, you know, like what might be appropriate for a long-term care facility is different than what might be appropriate for an organization that works exclusively outdoors, right? So look at your individual workplace and where do you find the risk of COVID transmission? Identify the scope and purpose of the policy, and then list the steps the workers must take. So what they say in their recommendation is that the policy should require proof of vaccination Or workers who do not provide proof of vaccination may need to, for example, indicate a medical exemption or complete a vaccination education course. But they don't say that those should be the only other options. And they don't say that either. Well, I mean, certainly, accommodation under the Human Rights Code is required, but they don't say you have to include this vaccine education course, although it might be nice. Set a deadline so that people have time to kind of comply. List available supports for vaccination, and provide some provisions for workers who are unable to be vaccinated for reasons protected by the Human Rights Code. But also, if you're not going to be requiring vaccinations across the board, this could also include provisions for people who choose not to get vaccinated, such as potentially a rapid test, right? Consequences for non-compliance with the policy, and consideration of privacy provisions. So, this is nice and somewhat frustrating in a way, because they don't come right out and mandate this is exactly what your policy should look like. They do leave a lot of discretion to a business, which is nice because you can kind of craft this depending on what the risk assessment is for your unique workplace. But at the same time, it can be a little frustrating for many employers, because they're going, well, okay, then what the heck am I supposed to do? Like, you didn't tell me. I want to know exactly what I'm supposed to do. So, but in any event, this is the requirements and the recommendations from the Halton Medical Officer of Health. For those who don't have 100 or more workers, you're not necessarily off the hook, because the Occupational Health and Safety Act applies to pretty much all workplaces, and it imposes a general duty on employers to take every precaution reasonable in the circumstances to protect the health and safety of a worker. This is called the General Duty Clause, and it is broadly interpreted. And in fact, very recently, the Court of Appeal has come out and said the General Duty Clause is broader than even that, even things that are statutory required. If it's something that an employer could reasonably do to protect safety, then they should be doing it. And in the case of vaccination policies, if, based off of your assessment of risk, having some sort of a vaccination policy in place would protect, or may reasonably protect the workers from an outbreak, then it could actually be required by the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Breach of the Occupational Health and Safety Act could result in fines up to $100,000, a 12-month prison term, or both. In addition to that, we also have to look at protecting the business from other sorts of liabilities. So potentially under common law, depending on the circumstances, a COVID outbreak may result in some liability for a business. So last year, the provincial government introduced some legislation called the Supporting Ontario's Recovery Act, and that provides that that bars liability due to infection or exposure to COVID in a place of business or work, provided that, this is the important part, provided that the business or workplace was acting or making a good faith effort to act in accordance with the law, and on the business not being grossly negligent. So if a vaccination policy is legal, it's legally required by either the Health and Safety Act or by whatever government statute, and you don't do it, then you don't get this protection from liability. Or if there's gross negligence, and gross negligence is a gross, like a big departure from the standard of care, then that could that may not allow you to rely on this act. So right now, I wouldn't say vaccination policies I don't think they are yet what's called the standard of care across all businesses, because I think a lot of employers are still trying to wrap their heads around it. But I think the ball is kind of rolling in that direction, and at some point it may get there where this does some sort of vaccination policy may rise to this level of the standard of care. Although I don't think it's there yet. So in conclusion, from that perspective, yes, the policy is necessary if mandated by the government, or if you have 100 or more workers in Halton, might be necessary depending on the risk level of COVID infection in your business. For other businesses, it could be a good defense to a claim, whether it's brought under the Occupational Health and Safety Act or just under common law. You could say, hey, well, we have this policy, we enforced it as best we could, you know, stuff happens, right? Like nothing's perfect. And then you could rely on that act. And yeah, they're legal, subject to the privacy and human rights laws. So those are those two big questions. Now, also a big question is, what should your policy look like? And, you know, I think, in my opinion anyways, this really depends on your specific workplace. How many employees do you have? What's the COVID situation like in the area in which you are working? Do you work, or do your employees work with vulnerable populations or not? Can your employees effectively work from home? What, can your employees social distance? These are all factors to take into consideration into a risk assessment. And you'll find that there's no one size fits all policy, right? Like, as I said before, what's appropriate for, like, let's say, you know, somebody doing maintenance on a golf course is maybe not the same as a nurse working in long-term care. So I think what, you know, the most important thing you do is this risk assessment, and that risk assessment should guide your policy. Although employers can implement whatever policies they want that comply with, you know, the law, potentially an unreasonable policy in light of the level of risk could result in a constructive dismissal claim from existing employees. And then it also, like a unreasonable policy could also result in, even if it's not a constructive dismissal, it could result in a big attrition of employees from your workplace. And you know, most employers want to avoid that. So I would encourage you to like look at kind of the broader scope of things and come up with a policy that's reasonable, makes sense in terms of the actual risk in your business. Prior to implementing a policy, you may want to consider doing an informal, non-mandatory survey of your employees to try and gauge how many are vaccinated, right? And so when you do that, you're not requiring a response, but assume that anybody who doesn't answer is not vaccinated. And you may find you only are dealing with 1 or 2 employees. You may find that you're just dealing with employees who do, you know, a certain type of work. So, you know, once you realize that the extent of the people who are unvaccinated, that can maybe help influence your policy, because you could say, okay, well, if you're not vaccinated, then these 2 people, you know, they're really good at doing this job where they don't have to be around other people, or they work outside, or those jobs can be effectively done from home for the time being. You know, you can kind of like consider those type of issues. But if you have, you know, a lot of people, or if you have people kind of across the board, or if you don't want to have remote work anymore, then, you know, you really should consider other types of less intrusive ways to protect health and safety. So, you know, some examples are modified duties, remote work, if effective, or, you know, a big one is that I see very commonly used is these rapid tests. So rapid tests are very, very quick, easy, and painless. And there's a couple of different ways to get access to a rapid test. So they are available to small and medium-sized businesses through the Chambers of Commerce, currently for free. But with the tests that are available through the Chamber, you need to have somebody on site that is trained and that actually administers the test. And another practical thing to take into consideration is you need to figure out a way to do this so that it's not, so it can be done discreetly, right? So it's not easily identifiable who is not vaccinated and who is not, and who is. And you would also want to do it before the individual comes into contact with other people in the office, because if they happen to have COVID and they did the rapid test after they sat down at their desk and they've already kind of like chatted with five or 10 different people, they've potentially exposed all those 5 or 10 different people. So that's just one thing to kind of think about. And some organizations have the resources to put something like that in place, but you know, some people that I've spoken to at least just aren't able to do that. So there are a couple of other options. COVID tests, the rapid tests are available for somebody to do through Shoppers Drug Mart. It costs $40. And then what the pharmacy will do is give the employees a written certificate that's signed and dated by the pharmacist. And that's given to the employee, not to the employer. And then the employer could ask for that certification. Although it costs $40, the Human Rights Commission has said that if anybody has an established human rights-based need for accommodation, then the employer needs to pay for these tests, right? Whether it's something that's offered through the chamber, or if it's this $40 one through Shoppers, the employer would need to pay for that for people who have human rights-based exemptions. Another option is Shoppers has a program where you could order rapid tests. It's a $14 administration fee for a set of 25 tests. Some employers are doing that and then giving the test to employees to do at home, and then asking the employees to either bring in, there's like a plastic applicator that shows 1 line or 2 lines, like are you positive or negative, asking the employee to bring that into the office and then disposing it in the office or taking a picture of it. The problem with this is that there's no way to really ensure that your employees are doing these tests correctly, nor do you know if they're somehow falsifying their results. So for example, if you have one of those applicators, if you do a COVID test, it'll show 1 line or 2. I did one as an example, as a test the other day, and that was a week ago, and it still shows the same result. So there's nothing that would stop me from taking a different picture of the same thing every day. And how is the employer going to prove that it's a different test that was taken every day, right? So there is some potential for employee abuse of that type of policy. And finally, I am told that Shoppers has a program that you can apply for where they will test employees and then send an email digital, or they will test the employees. And then Shoppers will send an email digital certificate of the test results directly to the employer. I was looking for some information about this program. I've contacted Shoppers directly. They haven't responded to me. So I don't know, is that available to everybody, what the cost is, how that works. I went and talked to the owner of a pharmacy. She didn't even know about this program. So I don't know, but apparently, potentially that's an option that's out there or maybe coming out there. But when you are considering whatever it is that you're doing as an alternative to vaccination, if you are allowing for an alternative to vaccination, I would suggest that you try, as much as you can to do it in a way where you're not easily identifying people who are unvaccinated. And I say this for 2 reasons. One, that's de facto disclosure of their medical information, which would be a breach of their privacy rights. But 2, this is such an emotional, hot button, political, crazy issue right now, and people are just nuts about it. And if you're making it so easily identifiable who's vaccinated, who's unvaccinated, you are really opening the door, I think, to conflict in the workplace. And I really do think that an issue we may be seeing more and more often in the coming months is harassment based off of vaccination status. So just something to take into consideration. Now, once you know what your various alternatives are for your employees, then we need to get into the detail of the policy. So the first thing is scope. Is this something that's going to be, applying to just your existing employees, or is it going to apply to new employees only? When it comes to new employees, by the way, you could probably get away with making vaccination a condition of employment subject to, human rights concerns, right? But with existing employees, then it's a little bit more complicated because there's the issue of constructive dismissal, etc. You should consider making and by the way, when you're considering scope, some businesses want to make this vaccination policy apply to their customers as well. Some don't. I would suggest, and this is sort of outside the scope of this talk, but I would suggest when you're doing that, consider, are you offering an essential service? And if you are offering an essential service, you might not want to make the policy apply to your customers. So I'll just leave it at that. If it's an interim policy, that would probably be best because, as we all know, the situation with this pandemic is constantly evolving, constantly changing, and what might be the case now might not be the case in February. Like maybe, God willing, after this fourth wave, there's no more COVID. Not likely, but if that's the case, then we need to revisit these. If we have another variant that's not against which these particular vaccines are not effective, then again, we need to revisit. So this needs to be sort of a living and breathing sort of policy document. With respect to the effective date, you want to give employees the opportunity to at least be vaccinated. So give them a couple weeks notice so they have time to go and get 1 or 2 vaccines. Think about what you are requiring as proof of vaccination. Right now, most employers are saying, just give me, whatever the PDF that you got from the government when you were vaccinated. But as Doug was saying, the government is coming out with this QR code. And the thing with the PDF is, again, it's easily falsified, right? So somebody could potentially take that PDF, convert it to a Word document, change the name, re-PDF it, and then send it to their employer. So I would suggest you ask for proof of vaccination in the form of this PDF for now, and then once the QR code comes out, ask to verify vaccination status, and then anybody who falsified their vaccination status could be terminated for cause without notice. Communication strategy, I think this is sometimes overlooked, but because of the emotions running high and the amount of misinformation out there, I think it's something very important in a way to kind of sell this policy to your employees. So again, tell them why you're doing it. I would shy away from terms, and I'm cognizant of the time, so just bear with me. Let me finish this slide and then we can adjust here. So I would don't call it a mandatory vaccination policy, because really, again, like I said, nobody's forcing vaccines into anybody's arms. This is just a vaccination policy. Also, I would avoid the use of the word anti-vaxxer, because that is also something that gets emotions running high. There is people who don't want to get the vaccine. We don't want to fan the flames here. And of course, ensure your policy accommodates human rights. So Scott, I do have just 2 more slides. Do I have time to finish them, or should I stop? Because I see the time.
Yeah, I'll go quickly. We've got some questions, but yeah, finish off.
Sure. Okay, so quickly, enforcement of the policy. This is a big question employers have. What do we do if people don't obey the policy? So if they refuse to provide proof of vaccination, we've already established that. Just treat them in your policy as somebody who is unvaccinated, or in the same way as somebody who's unvaccinated. If they refuse to get vaccinated, they would get whatever the alternative is as outlined in your policy. But if they refuse to do whatever the alternative is, whether it's performing regular rapid tests or something else, if your policy is reasonable, given the assessment of the business, you may be able to terminate without notice, either by virtue of termination for cause of frustration of contract due to requirements mandated by the Occupational Health and Safety Act. But this is still unknown and it's still being litigated. I know that plaintiff side lawyers are saying, no, you can't terminate for cause. This, you need to give me a package, right? So this is the great unknown as to whether or not, you know, somebody's entitled to a severance package if they get terminated because they don't obey the policy. Again, I think it is a fact-specific analysis that's really going to depend on A, what's mandated by the government, B, the level of risk in your specific workplace, and C, how reasonable your policy is in light of that risk. And the other great unknown is to what extent all this is going to have on notice periods, because presumably it would take employees longer to find another job. And then I don't think we have time to do recalling reluctant employees to work. So if anybody has questions about that, just feel free to reach out to me and I can talk to you about that one-on-one.
That's great, Kelly. That actually may be a reason to have a second webinar. So Doug, I don't know if you're able to come back on, but the first question that came in was about the temperature checks and whether people should still be doing temperature checks.
So temperature checks technically are not a mandatory requirement. However, they are a good business practice in regards to this. What it really comes down to is your due diligence and liability. So the Occupational Health and Safety Act states that every employer must do everything reasonable under the circumstance to protect the health and safety of the worker. And doing temperature checks as part of COVID-19, although it may not be mandatory, is actually a great additional measure that can go a long way towards preventing the exposure. So it's definitely reasonable to do them, and I would definitely continue doing them. However, you do need to make sure that you are doing the screening questions based on the Ministry of Health screening tool as well.
Kelly, there's one question here that asks, what happens if a patron calls a business to ask if all of their employees are vaccinated? Are they allowed to disclose that information?
That's a good question. I would say not unless you have the consent of your employees.
And Doug, I think this one is for you. Is it possible to remove your mask when you're sitting at your desk if you still have social distancing?
According to the law, no. How likely is it going to happen? You're probably going to remove your mask if you're sitting there and there's no one around and you're by yourself. Technically, according to the regulations, you are supposed to keep your mask on when you're indoors. However, if you can maintain physical distancing, you should be able to remove your mask. But as soon as someone comes within that 6 feet, you need to put your mask on.
The next question is for those that are required to assess customers for vaccines. What do they do if someone comes in that's under 18?
So I actually saw that question. So I went on to the Ministry of Health webpage into some of the Q&A documents they have, and they actually address that question. Well, not really, but they address it on there. So if somebody's required to be fully vaccinated, they must prove both vaccination and identity. The identification requirements are flexible, and identification is required to confirm only name of the person and date of birth. Government ID can be used for this purpose, however, it's not the only type of ID accepted. Proof of identity can be established using documentation issued by an institution or public body, provided it includes the name of the holder and date of birth. Identification that young people may have access to that include name and date of birth can include birth certificate or a passport, among other forms of ID. Businesses should establish processes to ensure compliance with the requirement, including processes to ensure compliance with this requirement when a business or organization is uncertain whether a person is under 12 years of age. However, there is an exemption from this requirement for facilities used for sports and recreation. So as you can see, the government has kind of tiptoed and sidestepped around actually answering that. You just need to make sure that you can provide an actual copy of the actual original copy of the piece of ID, and it needs to be a piece of ID that has the name and date of birth on it. So I know parents are probably going to look at this and say, well, I don't want to send my kid to school or somewhere with their birth certificate or passport on them, because that could easily go missing. However, in many cases, depending on the situation, that could also, the parents could also be with the children. So it could be a lot easier for the parents to carry that ID on them for their child as well. So at this point, there's nothing specific that says that you can accept a piece of paper or a written note from a parent or anything like that. They do need to carry the piece of ID. However, once October 21st or 2nd or whatever it was does come, I think with the QR codes, there could be some changes coming with that. So
Kelly, did you want to address that too?
I'm going to address something else.
Okay.
Which was the question about wearing the mask at your desk. So in Halton, there is a mask bylaw, and one of the exemptions in the mask bylaw is employees and agents of the person responsible for the public place within an area designated for them, being an area designated for the employees, and not for public access, or within or behind a physical barrier. In both instances where a physical distance of at least 2 meters can be maintained at all times. So in other words, if the employees are in an area where that is not accessible to the public, and they can maintain a physical distance of 2 meters, they are exempted from this mask mandate. Or if it is an area that's accessible to the public, they are exempt if they're behind a physical barrier like plexiglass, and they maintain this physical distance of 2 feet, or 2 meters, sorry.
Okay, thank you. So there's one more question in the chat, and then I'll open it up to any live questions. But the last one in the chat, we know some environments who are mandated to do COVID checks on customers, patrons, are openly being protested, or they're protesting and they're inviting all individuals into their establishments. What type of accountability falls on the individual employees working in these environments? Can they be fined? What if the employee is not comfortable with the business decision not to screen, and then they're forced to quit if the employer is not protecting them under this new legislation?
Kelly, do you mind if I start with that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so for a worker still has a right to refuse unsafe work if they have reason to believe it puts them or a fellow worker in danger. And that does include the current requirements with regards to COVID-19 and concerns about their safety. So if that is the case, as an individual employee, your first step would be to report it to the employer. And if the employer decides not to do anything about it, then your next step would be to call the Ministry of Labor and have them come in and do an investigation. And in that case, that's where it could be addressed and for a lot further. So
I would also say in this situation of high conflict, that could potentially, just give rise to a constructive dismissal claim right off the bat. And then I would also suggest to that employee that they may want to file an anonymous complaint.
Yeah.
Okay, if anyone has a question they want to ask, if you use the Zoom raise your hand feature, then I can see that you have a question. Oh, Michelle, if you want to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Can everyone hear me, first of all?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great.
Yes.
I think, Kelly, you addressed this. I just want to clarify, just so I can take this back to my peeps. So can our accommodation look like a work from home model if we do have folks who are not disclosing or refuse to disclose if they are vaccinated, or have come right out and said, I still would like to work here, but I'm not going to get vaccinated?
So can it? Yes, it could. But some businesses don't want to do that because they find that it's not really as effective, or, like, for example, they may have had some, technological systems in place temporarily when everybody was working remotely, and then now
Right.
those have been moved back in-house, so it's just not as practical anymore. But if that's something they want to do, then certainly it is an option. another factor to take into consideration, and this also really depends on the nature of your business, but allowing unvaccinated employees to work from home while requiring vaccinated people to come into the office could result in some conflict amongst staff, particularly if many staff want to work from home, but they happen to be vaccinated. Now they feel like they're being penalized for being vaccinated.
Sure. Okay, yeah, that makes total sense. And then my other question, just one more, sorry, is I think you touched on this about making or having or not mandating, but having a proof of vaccination as a requirement of employment. So in the recruiting process, how do we go about that? I think you did touch on it. I just want to clarify.
So again, like the risk of constructive dismissal obviously doesn't exist for people who don't work for you yet. So, you know, you could put proof of vaccination status as a condition of employment. And we often see, you know, criminal reference checks and things like that as conditions of employment.
Sure.
I would just suggest that you build in, you know, something in the fine print, you know, if you have a need for accommodation under the Human Rights Code, please advise Human Resources, and, you know, we will consider your need for accommodation up to the point of undue hardship. There are some plaintiff side firms and others who are suggesting, well, you know, if you make, you know, vaccination a condition of employment, that's, you know, that's discrimination based off perceived disability. But that's not necessarily the case, provided that you build in that, you know, fine print of accommodation under the Human Rights Code.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Paul, coming to you next.
Thank you. First, that was a great presentation. Really good. Question was partially answered. Hypothetically, if not vaccinated during the interview process, as part of getting an interview for the job, can we actually ask for proof of vaccination, so we can even avoid going to that point of finding a good employee and then finding out that they're not vaccinated?
I would say, and again, all of this is unprecedented, so there's no case law on the issue on any of this stuff. But I would say I don't see any reason why you couldn't even put that in your job ad, provided that you build in that, you know, caveat where if you have a requirement for accommodation under the Human Rights Code, please advise us, and, you know, we will accommodate you up to the point of undue hardship.
That actually helps a lot, because that descriptions now, so that it basically bases that we're a science-based company, and you know, we're in support of vaccination. So we just need to put in the human rights clause included in that, and then we should be okay to go.
I think so.
Again, thank you very much.
There's no guarantees in litigation, but I don't see any reason why that wouldn't be appropriate.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Jennifer, to you next.
Hi, my question's for Doug. It's just to follow up one of the earlier questions about, I know in your presentation you had mentioned that there could be fines for the individuals as well as for the corporations if they're not following this new legislation. So for the individuals, the question around the employee in some of these work environments where they're kind of actively protesting the screening process right now, is the individual, like say a waitress or a hostess at a restaurant, are they liable if they're not actually doing the screening, even though the employer is promoting that they're not requiring that screening to be done?
I think in those instances, I can't see the employee being fined in that sense. What they usually will do in that case is they almost always go after the employer. The employer ultimately has the authority over the workplace, so they will go after the employer. If the employee is willfully and neglecting or completely disregarding the COVID requirements, then the employee could be fined in that sense. But this could also be looked at as a situation where the employee may feel afraid of the employer and what could happen if they decide to go against the employer. So in this case, I can't see them fining the employee. I would see this as more as fining the supervisors and the employer in that sense. The health and safety laws do mandate that it is up to the employers and supervisors to do everything reasonable to protect the health and safety of their workers in the workplace. So if it is a worker and they feel they can't do it, then it would go back to anonymous complaint, as Kelly stated, filing that with the Ministry of Labor, or invoking the right to refuse process.
Kelly, do you want to add to that?
I would say that in some circumstances where somebody is completely going out on a limb and acting outside of the scope of their employment agreement and basically has gone rogue, there are times, not necessarily that they would get fined individually, but potentially the business could have cause of action against them. So if the business gets fined and they went off on this rogue, in some circumstances, you might be able to see that, although it would have to be definitely supported by the facts. It would have to be very clear that they were going out on a limb. The employer would have to have their policies in place that you're not supposed to be doing this. The employer should be enforcing those policies, et cetera, et cetera. But if the employer is sort of like just closing their eyes to it, that's the employer then being willfully blind, and they're responsible to, manage their workplace, and that employee should be disciplined.
Thank you.
Good. I don't see any other hands up. So I think we might be done with questions. Doug and Kelly, do you want any closing comments?
Sure. We are in an unprecedented time, and for myself specifically, I'm happy to answer any further questions that might arise as we are going through this. We are also on our end too, kind of learning on the fly as well. So we can appreciate the concerns that business owners may have. So I think the Chamber does a really good job of communicating information. And if there are any questions that you have with regards to the health and safety aspects for your workplace, specifically with this or anything else, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm happy to assist anybody who contacts me. So.
Yeah, I would echo those comments. I mean, first of all, I want to say thank you again to Scott and everybody at the Chamber for having me here. I really enjoy giving these talks. I see it sort of as a public service announcement because, again, like Doug says, we are in unprecedented times. This is really confusing for people in the know, let alone people who are just trying to run their business. So I don't take it lightly, my obligation to help people. And if you have any questions, let me know. I'll do my best to guide you through this and with all of the challenges that are going to be coming up in the workplace over the next little bit.
That's terrific. And I would say too, if anyone has any questions that haven't been answered, you can email me. I can give them to Doug and Kelly, and then we could even post those so everyone that's interested could see the answers as well. What we know that within the Chamber network, we have amazing resources, amazing companies, and Doug and Kelly proved that once again today. So thanks to Doug and Kelly for your expertise and the presentations and the quality of the information you've given us today. Remember, everyone, if you haven't already, get your shot. And if you need rapid test kits, we still have lots at the Chamber office, and KN95 masks donated to us by Rockwell. And as I said at the beginning, right now we have, sitting at Gordon Food Service, we have 52 skids of Lysol wipes. So we'll be giving those away for free. So watch your Chamber e-newsletters. With that, thanks everyone. Stay safe. See you next time.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Stay safe.
Thanks, everyone. Bye. Stay safe.